being outlaws is in our DNA. That's what it is to be American. We're always the rebel opposition. We're always outnumbered. We're always hated. We're also feared and respected. I wouldn't have things any other way. I'm having a good time. Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Greene Tavern. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Tonight we have a special guest. That'll be Mr. Ron Dodson, and we have a very interesting conversation coming up for you. It's going to be generally around the topic of usury. Ron, why don't you take some time to kind of introduce the audience to who you are, what your background is, and then you can segue into the topic in whichever way seems best.
All right. Well, I'm in my upper 50s, which is painful to say. It seemed like yesterday I was in my 20s and meeting my wife and all that kind of stuff. But I'm from Dallas, Texas, and went to Southern Methodist, accounting, finance, double major, UT graduate degree in derivative finance, and have been in the hedge fund world ever since, and also helping to run, we have a family business in real estate. And this has given me, since I'm staring at screens full of squiggly lines all day, I've made continued my childhood love for reading, philosophy, theology, political theology, and a love for great literature. And so I write and I read and I stare at squiggly lines on screens all day, and so I just really enjoy, I think I was inculcated from a young age by my grandfather that God was gracious to put you on this earth. You need to spend your life learning about it and enjoying it. And so that really has meant the world to me, is to have a lifetime of learning about how things work, why they are the way they are, why are people the way they are, what is the meaning and purpose. And I think tonight's topic really speaks to that, is how does money play a part in that? How does money relate to time and risk? And how does it tell us, how does it communicate to us how we feel and treat other human beings who, for some of us, we believe are made in the image of our Creator? So I'm really looking forward to talking about usury and all the things that implies tonight with you guys.
Yeah, no, we're very much looking forward to it. Again, we thank you for joining us. I think, it would be best to start with the definition. I think a lot of people kind of have an idea of what usury is, but there's actually two rather distinct definitions, and if you try to extrapolate this topic, the difference becomes important pretty quick. So there's two schools of thought. One being that it is sort of contrary to nature for money to grow, so to speak. So in other words, if money is growing on the basis of interest, that is unnatural, and therefore it implies a sort of theft. That would be the first opinion. And the second opinion would be that capital can, in a sense, grow, even though it's not organic, because it's a tool essentially that you can use for growth, and so it should make sense that money can sort of grow in a way on its own as long as it's invested. And in that case, it wouldn't necessarily be theft, although there are ways to go about it that become exploitive, and of course it starts becoming theft at that point. So of those two schools, which side of that do you fall on, so to speak?
I'm going to say both, and here's why. I mean, that first definition is most famous. I'm convinced that Plato read Moses, and that first definition really is elucidated by Aristotle, who thought it perverse that money in and of itself would grow. And this is the idea of rentier, which is the idea that just because of your position and I don't want to get too technical because we'll get boring real fast, but it's the idea that just because of my position, I can extract rent, money being one of those things, at the expense of the less powerful among us. And what that does is what Moses and Aristotle both were getting at, I believe, is this idea that to view your fellow citizen, in Moses' case, that would be the fellow covenant member. In Aristotle's case, the citizen. It is wrong to exploit that person because you are effectively putting them. You are viewing them as a slave, and who are you to as later in the Bible, the Apostle Paul says, "Who are you, O man, to view another as your servant?" And so that idea, and we know from Aristotle and from Moses, this wasn't a blanket prohibition on slavery as such. Chattel slavery, they would have both thought was perverse, but this idea of bond servitude was throughout the Old Testament and certainly through the Athenian and Roman worlds. So I say both because I think we what we do is, the word in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, for usury is this word neshek, and it literally means a bite. And the idea is that any demand of return is you're basically robbing from the person you are lending to. And we could just go, the first mention, I believe, is in Exodus 22. And it says, if you lend money to any of my people, any covenant members who are poor among you, you shall not be like a money lender to him. You shall not charge him interest. By the way, all through, like you see in Hammurabi's code and so on and so forth, money lending was a practice in the ancient world, and I believe in Hammurabi's code, it's as much as 33% return if you lent silver, and 20 something percent if you lent grain. So lending for even massive returns. But the difference is what set apart the old covenant. I'm just tell you guys, I don't know where you guys are, but I'm coming from I'm a devout Christian. So that's kind of where, but I also am a classicist. So I love Plato and Aristotle and the Socratic tradition. So what they were saying is, what the difference between the kind of the normative old world or ancient world was of exorbitant interest, and where the Hebrews set themselves apart and the Greeks followed suit was, no, among your fellow people, you're not going to do that. That's wrong. And it wasn't. It was. This isn't the case of. Well, how about I stop right there and let y'all comment, and then we can get on to the next point.
Well, I think that's a kind of an interesting frame you have there, especially about kind of the root of usury. If you kind of, obviously you could trace it all the way back to something like greed or pride, but I like what you said about kind of one of the roots of usury being this attitude of rent seeking. That I am somehow entitled to what someone else has because I have an advantage over them. And so I have the right to sort of use that advantage to extract, rent from my fellow man. It almost made me think, I know this isn't the traditional application of usury. It did kind of make me think of what you might see in sort of the old feudal system. In that case, it really was, you were extracting rent in a more literal sense from your tenants. And I suppose there was some extent to which that was due because the Lord would provide things like protection for them. But it's also well known that that system was abused. And there was kind of this attitude a lot of times where, like, well, I'm the Lord and you're dependent on me. So if I want to make you give me a third of your crops, well, you just have to do it. And if not, I can just kill you, I suppose, or have you sent to jail, more likely. But I think that's the attitude. It's the idea of, because I have an advantage, I can just push that advantage as far as I can without, eliciting too strong of a pushback, instead of having some sort of attitude of forbearance where it's like, I have the right to ask for just compensation for what I offer you, but I don't have the right to unduly leverage my position. Does that make sense? Is that kind of driving with what you're thinking?
Yeah, and I think as we go along, I think we'll see that where we're going is not to give away the plot, but where we're going is there's always been, among the more thoughtful, the foundation of the West is an attitude of not taking advantage of the disadvantaged. And so that's really, and we all want I know I do. I'm a finance guy. I'm a hedge fund guy. I want a mathematical model, and really what the Socratics, what the wisdom of the Bible is speaking to, is an attitude of the heart where you regard your fellow covenant member, your fellow citizen, as a co-laborer with you. And the rentier thing, I think where it's a little different on the feudal system is that's based upon land and productivity, not just a pure need. But let's keep going and seeing kind of how this idea develops, if y'all are okay with that. Yeah. So, Keybot, you're kind of I can't hear exactly what you said. If you asked a question, you mind repeating it?
Oh no. Sorry, mic issue. I think we got Luke back. Luke, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, go ahead, Chief.
Yeah, so something I was wanting to bring up was Proverbs 28:8 kind of puts a little bow on that.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, He that by usury and unjust gain increaseth his substance, he shall gather it for him that will pity the poor. And so it's kind of saying pretty much what we were just talking about, how in the practice of usury, in collecting money just from the fact you have money and you're in a position to give it, you're going to probably end up taking that from someone who's disadvantaged. And the reason why they're asking for money in the first place is because they are not in a position where they have money. And so in practicing usury, you're extracting something from people that they didn't have in the first place. And you're creating a disadvantage on top of people who are already disadvantaged. So it just kind of exponentially increases problems.
Totally agreed. And we see this, in the economy writ large, in that our modern American economy is basically built on all this, right? Even the currency itself is no longer solid. It's fiat. It's based upon you put $100 in the bank, they're going to lend out 90 of that, and so you create, and then when they deposit it, they're going to lend out 90% of that, and so you create out of $1 $50, right? And so the currency itself has no solid basis, and so you have an entire economy that's kind of based upon this taking advantage of, because what does that do? Well, anytime you have a greater supply, in this case of dollars, prices go up because you have more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. So you forced the poor into a situation of having to participate in this system just so they can afford to live. And so backing out of this is incredibly difficult. Once you go down this path of not only leverage, of debt being a part of not creating equity for yourself, but of everyday life, you create a situation where the non-moneyed, the people who live paycheck to paycheck, the folks who are trying to get by, almost have to participate in this whole nonsense just to live, because everything is inflated by this very mechanism. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think it's funny that you mentioned that too, because I'm not a Catholic myself, but I think there's a lot to be gained from looking to the early church fathers, and especially a lot of those early Catholic writings. And from the Catholic Catechism, it says, those whose usurious dealings lead to the hunger and death of their brethren in the human family indirectly commit homicide, which I think is interesting, because it's tying usury to the commandments, and it's saying, you are killing people by extracting something that would have fed them. And if these people die because they're hungry, you have broken the commandments because you decided to be predatory towards these, I guess, underprivileged people, these people who are not of high status or moneyed. And I think that's a real interesting way to tie it together, because there's a ton of writing and literature out there about usury, but I think tying it to the commandments, or tying it to something higher than just like, oh, well, is 10% acceptable, or is 33% too much, or, trying to toe the line on it, and just kind of saying like, well, if you're really harming people, like if someone dies, if someone really gets hurt because of your practices, like that is a sin, and you're to blame.
Right. Well, Paul says that the person who shall not eat is the person who is unwilling to work, not the person who might need a loan to get by. So, I think your instincts are exactly right on that. And so with that, so the Old Testament really goes. I love 28:8. I had that. It's great that you picked that out because I had that to talk about. And it's interesting, the Septuagint reading, I think you read from the King James, which is based on the Textus Receptus and the Masoretic text. The King James, the Septuagint even puts it simpler, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It says, he who increases his wealth by interest and usury gathers it for the one who will be kind to the poor. In other words, look, God's righteous purposes are going to be, you're not going to escape God's purposes in this. So if you're exploiting the poor, that's really not going to work out for you in the end. I absolutely love that. So Ezekiel, it's interesting. It says, and Ezekiel is prophesying about the return to the land from the exile when the Israelites were taken off into exile. And then Ezekiel prophesies. He's basically the high priest in exile. And he prophesies about going back to the land. And he says, he who has not exacted usury or taken increase, he is just or righteous. It's the same word. He shall surely live. He who gives on usury and takes increase, shall he then live? He shall not live. And again, that's basically a commentary on the quote from Proverbs, is that God's righteous purposes in this will win out, either here on earth or in eternity. But you taking advantage of others is not a good plan. Jesus says in Luke, he says, if you lend to those to whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? Listen to how he ties it. He says, but love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return. And this introduces a very interesting thing, because Jesus doesn't prohibit this word interest. In his parable about the talents, he says, why did you go bury the talents I gave you? If you gave it to the bank, I would earn interest in return. But it seems to be that the tie is that you should only be looking for return when risk is involved. Now, this isn't exactly explained in the New Testament, but there's this understanding that return is part and parcel of participation, of risk, of partnership, of covenant, which makes perfect sense. Because if let's say Luke or Kevbot and I are covenantally tied, if you're my brother, I'm not going to try to lend to you and expect return to your disadvantage. I want us all to win, right? Because that's what's best for all of us. It's again this call to this covenantal bonding. And what we're missing, I think, in what's happened in the last, since the creation of the Federal Reserve in this country, and when lending went from really something you did to either finance your crops or so on and so forth, to really being part and parcel of everyday life at high interest rates, is a destruction of the covenantal understanding of the United States as a nation. In other words, we're really not a nation anymore. They're just, there's so-and-so down the road. I can sue him, which is prohibited in the Bible, if they're a covenant member, if I'm tied to them, if they're part of the church, for instance. No, that's somebody I can just take advantage. Sucks to be them if I have to foreclose on them. So I think what we're missing or what is being highlighted and what many people are yearning for, and why usury is now, I get questions about usury 2 or 3 times a month now, where you just didn't hear about it much, is younger men are feeling this emptiness of not being covenantally tied to their fellow citizens. What do you guys feel that? Do you feel that lack that we're just an enterprise zone? We're not. We don't have common cause. I'm kind of throwing you a softball, I think.
Well,
No,
Yeah.
I think it's a common thing. I think that a lot of us feel, and I think the tie-in specifically to usury is, you mentioned something interesting about how the key, with lending a lot of times does have to do with exposure to hazard. If not hazard, at least exposure to loss. Like you're parting with your money for so someone can employ it for another end. But you also mentioned something too about a big key here being that the return you're asking for is fair. It in order for it not to be fraud, it does have to be a fair return. And I do think this kind of ties into another economic thing that even goes, I think, broader than usury, but it's something that modern American culture really lacks, which is the idea of distributive justice. And that's the idea of equivalent exchange. So if you are going to if you're going to ask someone to give you money or try to get someone to give you money, it needs to be in a fair return for something. It could be a fair return for a good that you're giving them. It could be a service that you're rendering to them. It could be something of yours that you're letting them borrow for a fee. And then that's actually kind of an extent what interest on a loan is. You're renting capital to them for a lease essentially. But because people no longer in America feel like, well, okay, so sorry, let me start over. For a lot of young people, economically, what they feel like is not only is it an economic zone, it's an economic zone that's explicitly built on unfair transaction. And it's unfair transaction because the other party doesn't want, not only isn't interested in you receiving, due compensation for your parted money, they actually would prefer you to suffer. So young men, I would say especially young white men in America, get the feeling, and I think a lot of times it's accurate, that America is sort of set up increasingly in a way where they are just expected to give up more and more money for less and less return. And when you complain that it's not fair, they'll just say, well, you deserve it. For X number of reasons, the left has about 1 million you can choose from at any given time. But that's kind of the idea. Like, we actually, like, you deserve to give us, like, we deserve for you to give us money for non-equivalent exchange, and it's because you're guilty of something, and that's just the way it is. And if you complain, then you're the problem. And so, yeah, that of course leads to a ton of isolation. And the economics isn't just, accidental to that. I think that's a substantial part of the problem.
Well, I think that's interesting too, because that's contrary to the founders of this land, even going before the founding of America. When you read about John Winthrop and what he said on charity and how he lived his life, and you see the type of people who founded the colonies, who put up the first settlements. I mean, John Winthrop died as a destitute man, because when one of his fellow Christians would come to him in need of money, he handed it to them freely. There was no usury at all in the beginning of this, British colony experiment out here. These people rejected that wholeheartedly. John Winthrop railed against it, and his entire practice of Christian charity was to bring up his fellow man. Was to make sure that everyone was fed, make sure that things worked well. And if he had more, if he had something to give, he would give it freely, and he never expected anything in return. And the GDP goes up, fellers nowadays would definitely reject the way Winthrop died, because he didn't have a beach house and a lake house, and he died in his home with not a lot of money to his name. He went from a very successful business owner in England to just barely getting by in America, or the British colonies at the time. But he, just because he gave it all away, and it was to help people. But that's the thing, the Lord still watched over him. He didn't starve to death. He wasn't killed by savages. His house wasn't burned to the ground. The Lord still watched over him and gave him everything he needed. It's just he was let's say, faithful enough to give away his excess. And to me, John Winthrop is a model for what America should be like. To look back at one of our original founders, the man who set in motion the principles and the ideas of what this land was supposed to be like. And if he were to see the way this country is run today, I mean, I imagine he's rolling over in his grave right now, just knowing that it is the way it is right now, where people, parents aren't passing down their inheritance. They're blowing it on cruises. Trump came out with a 50-year mortgage and a 15-year, auto loan you can take now, like just exorbitant and completely detrimental usury practices.
Amen to that, man. Winthrop, what his capital seeded, really seeded a big part of the founding. What a great example. One of the things that really drives this is, I'm going to get not too technical, but technical for just a minute, is this idea of time value of money. So time value of money says that if I have $1 today, it's worth more than $1 5 years from now, because of fiat currency. That dollar is no longer a solid medium of exchange. And this is what drove a lot of the philosophy behind the patristic understanding of usury was, well, if we're dealing with gold, if anything, as commerce increases, gold increases in value slowly, but I mean, not lately slowly, lately rapidly, but over time it increases in value, or at least stays the same, because it's a scarce asset, and commerce and people, as we fill the earth and commerce increases, it's worth more. So why would you demand a return above on, if I'm lending gold or silver, a solid medium of exchange? Why would I demand a return? Forget all the other factors that we've discussed. But now we're dealing with dollars that tomorrow my dollar is worth less than it is to me today. And we drive what's called time preference. And we drive this, I've got to charge interest because I've just got to get back to zero, to get my dollars back. And so the very system is evil. And so what we do is we turn savers because of this. We turn, used to in the old days before this all started happening, people would put money in their mattress or bury it in the yard. And that may be silly, when they could have put it in the bank, but so on and so forth. They weren't worried about it. They just wanted to make sure they could get it. And now that's insane, because I put $10,000 in the yard. Well, when I go and dig it up, it's worth $5,000. Why do I want to do that? And so we create this entire, I heard a commentator once say, and I think it's brilliant, the God of the Bible is the God who is anti-time preference. He's the God of low time preference. And what we've done is we've created this satanic system that drives people to spend whatever they have today, lest it go away. And that is wrong. And I think it is part of what drives this usurious water we're swimming in. And we can't even recognize what it is because we just, we breathe it.
I do have one sort of clarification question on that. So you're right, certainly, that the fiat nature of our currency exaggerates things like time preference quite a bit. But I think there's an argument that could be made that there is some sort of time value of money that would exist even if you didn't have a fiat currency. And so what I mean is, because even though you don't have the inflationary nature of the asset itself, you do have opportunity cost. So if you had, for example, let's just say 10 ounces of gold, and if you retained possession of it, you could take that 10 ounces of gold and you can invest it. I'm not sure if that would be in an older economy. Maybe you could get better horses or better, like, like oxen, or you could, buy a better quality of grain, or you could, acquire a new servant or something along those lines. But, somebody wants to borrow it. Now, of course, if you just want to do this charity, that's fine. But, if you let someone borrow that gold, and let's say they even return it to you, let's say 3 years later, and he gives it to you, and let's just say the asset itself hasn't inflated, you still gave up your investment cost.
Yeah.
Would you say that are you saying that sort of logic? Well, I guess what I'm saying.
No, I agree. I absolutely agree with that. I was just using the example of fiat as driving. So opportunity cost tend to drive savings and investment. They don't tend to drive expenditure. So you have two forces at work. But have you looked at, we've had incredible returns over the last 100 years in our stock market, especially the last, since the fall, the end of 29 to now. Incredible returns. But then look at them with a currency deflator, and it's incredible the difference, right? So my only point is, absolutely, there's this economic opportunity cost that is very real. That any asset, there's the sense in which any asset is not productive is wasted, and I agree with that. The point is that tends to drive, that incentivizes savings and investment. That doesn't incentivize profligacy. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. So I agree that it certainly wouldn't push like waste. I guess what I'm getting at though is, do you believe, and I guess maybe this could be a good point of debate, and not that we have to do a full blown debate. I just want to hear your point of view. So do you think that it would be usurious to expect some sort of return for lost opportunity cost if you were lending a non-inflationary asset?
I'm going to dodge. It's going to sound like a dodge. I think that's the wrong question. I think that lending on anything that doesn't have a surety basis is probably a bad idea. So, for instance, this is the concept of duration matching. So, for instance, y'all are familiar with the concept of depreciation, and this is huge right now in the whole blow up with. I just wrote a Substack about this actually, of how to finance AI investment, and so these SPVs have been created, special purpose vehicles, in order to take in vast amounts of money in order to lend to finance these massive chip, factories or whatever. And it's interesting, the duration on these notes and these SPVs is 5 years, but the depreciation schedule for the chips themselves before they have to be recycled out is 3 years. Well, tell me if that makes sense. There's no surety there. Is that right? So, and this isn't a usury argument. This is a duration matching argument. So how do we tie this back to usury? Well, what's the life of this phone? We're not doing video, but the guys in the chat can see. What's the life of this phone? Well, it's probably different for each person, but I don't know, 4 years, 5 years, something like that. If that's the case, then should I be using a credit card that I might pay off over 8 years to buy it? I'm subjecting myself to usury, right? Because there's no surety there. I am not using this loan to increase my marginal utility. And again, this sounds real technical, and it's not really a technical topic, but I think the technical aspects help us understand it. Am I using a loan to improve my station, to improve my productivity, to feed my family over a longer period of time than what I am loaning for? That is going to increase beyond, when I invest, am I investing at a rate that is going to improve my investors' return beyond what they can get just by sticking it in government securities? If not, then I'm really not doing them. I'm not providing utility to them, right? They can just go do that without having to pay me anything, right? So there's an aspect in usury that is not mathematical. It is for what purpose, and that's kind of how I kind of like to land this airplane. Is we are called to wisdom. In the old covenant, you're given these rules. You cannot do this. You cannot do that. And yet, most of these things are Jesus, for instance, you were subject to slavery in the old covenant. If you didn't pay back a loan, forget the interest based on it, you could be sold into slavery, or you had to give up your land. And that was all returned in the year of Jubilee. Well, when Jesus comes along, he basically says the year of Jubilee has happened in me. In other words, that system is done for. I am your Jubilee. We are no longer slaves. Well, if that's the case, did he abrogate the whole system? Did he abrogate the teaching that the system was, the word that Torah, which means law, we translate as law, really means in Hebrew instruction. So the purpose, go ahead. Did you want to jump in, Kevbot? Okay, so anyway, the purpose is all this stuff isn't to give us a formula. It's to give us wisdom so that we know how to do well and right. So in the new covenant, under Christ, who's done away with Jubilee, so there's no recovery of slavery. There's no recovery of I'm going to go take your land, and on the kind of loans we're talking about here. So do we just, Gary North, who I absolutely love, very wise guy, he's passed away now, but I love his teaching. He was an economics and history guy. But he basically says, you don't need to worry about any of it because Jesus is the Jubilee. And so now it's fine. It's a free-for-all. He was kind of libertarian on this. And I think that's just wrong. I think the law teaches us, is instructive to give us wisdom to know when we're taking advantage of somebody else. And there's not a hard and fast mathematical formula. But I do know that the amount of debt that is implicit, consumer debt specifically, that is implicit in the United States economy creates slaves out of us all. Even those of us who don't have a lot of consumer debt, we're swimming in this world where it is dog eat dog. Can I take advantage of my neighbor who I'm supposed to love? And so I don't think there is a formula, but I do think there's a principle at work. And then maybe that's not satisfying.
Well, no, I actually, I think that's actually kind of where I land too, because, when I look at American laws, okay, so let's go back to the Reformation for a second. So during the Reformation, there was sort of a willingness to relook at some traditional ethical practices, especially where people thought there might be some legalism, right? And so a lot of the reformers did push back on some of Rome's more wooden interpretations of, or I guess you could say like total bans on usury. And they said, well, no, it's okay in some circumstances, especially if you're lending to the wealthy, for like wealth creation purposes. And it's fine, but like they always had these cautions about, like you should always make sure you're offering at fair rates. In fact, you should probably be relying on sort of generalized market rates so that you're not tempted to inflate the value of your own loans, that sorts of thing. And so when I look at that and then I see American consumer finance law, there's a lot of good there. I think there was, you sort of see the fruit of some of that Reformation teaching. There are a lot of financial protections for consumers. There's rather lenient bankruptcy laws if things go too far south. But there is one big glaring error, and this is where you get to about it can't just all come down to math. Like, there's a lot of good consumer finance stuff, but there has to be some common sense, right? And one thing we see is that, especially credit card companies, even though there's these consumer protection laws for these poor people, there's also systems they have in place to trick you into not taking advantage of those protections you have. So, for example, credit card minimums, I think, are a great example of this. There are ways to use credit cards in a way that doesn't really enslave you, but credit card companies like to structure things like minimum payments to where you're not making any progress on your principal, or you're making very, very, very little. And so you end up, like you said, taking 8 years to pay off a purchase you made that doesn't have any benefit to you now. It's been years since you benefited from it, but you're still paying on it. But it's because there's an exploitive attitude in our culture that says, even if there are these protections, I bet you I can trick these people into not taking advantage of them. And then here you go 8 years later and you're stuck in a debt cycle. And so I think you're right. That's where a lot of that wisdom comes in. It's learning how to spot the greediness that we kind of, as a culture, bring to the table in these economic transactions. And so even where there are protections, they get subverted. And so it goes beyond math. It just goes back to the attitude that's driving all of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. What we're missing is, not to sound Pollyanna, but this was the role, ultimately, this is the role of the king as Lord Protector, right? Who says, okay, this has gone too far. We're running this back. And the problem is, in a mass democracy, you can't do that, because you've got to serve the immediate wants of the lowest common denominator, and instead of protecting them, they don't want to be protected. And so, and I'm not a nanny state guy, but on the other hand, this seems like clear instruction throughout history. Let's go ahead and talk about what we're not supposed to talk about, which is the rise of how this all really, the pushback came against the church in the West. And that was, the rabbinical Judaism took the letter of the Old Testament, which said, which they interpreted to say Christians weren't covenant members, so they could charge whatever interest they wanted towards those, from their perspective, heathen. And it became a very much a race to compete with that. And then the Italian, in the Lombard region, you had several of the Italian families who finally jumped on the bandwagon and participated too. And then you get to where we are today. And again, I'm not here to blame all our ills on a particular ethnic group. That's not my point. The point is you had a group that was not held to the same covenantal standards, the same expectations of brotherly duty, that were a hack to the system. And that's always going to be a hack to a system that doesn't have a sovereign who can protect you, a judge who guarantees the covenant. A covenant is different from a contract. A contract is just two parties. Hey, I've got to have performance and I've got to have consideration, right? For those of you who are legal minded, that's what guarantees a contract. A covenant is different. A covenant has a guarantor and a witness. You see this all throughout the Old Testament. When each covenant was made, you had a guarantor, which was God, and you had a witness, which was always a Gentile. Isn't that weird? Ron, what are you talking about? Well, the Abrahamic covenant. Abraham, right before he becomes a Jew and gets circumcised, he has Melchizedek, a Gentile priest of the God Most High, who is the sponsor of the Abrahamic covenant. You have the Mosaic covenant, and you have Jethro, a Gentile sponsor or witness of the Mosaic covenant. He's a priest of the God Most High, and so on and so forth. You have you have the king of Persia, who ultimately sponsors the Jews in the restoration covenant, who is witness to the restoration. And so that's what we are missing, is we are now a nation of raw contract. And all this teaching about usury really calls us to covenant, which means there must be a protector, guarantor of rights, of protection, and a witness, which is supposed to be in the American system. You have the executive, and then you have the courts and the legislature, which are, the Bible has this idea of two witnesses. Those are the two witness sponsors. And we've lost that. That is completely gone. And I don't mean to sound like a raving lunatic preacher here, but I think that's what we are missing. That's what we were all yearning for. That's what we were all hoping for, or at least I was, when Trump was reelected. Are we going to have someone who exerts true executive Article 2 power and is my protector? Are we going to see the legislature, therefore, be required to actually legislate again instead of these stupid continuing resolutions? I think all of this, and now, so usury is where this comes to bear, because people are being exploited. And who is there to protect them? No one. There's no one, because we no longer live in a nation of covenant. We live in a nation of contract. And I don't know how it ends. I really don't. And I'm not a black pill guy. I'm a very optimistic guy. I know the Lord God wins in the end, but how we get there from here to there, I don't know. I really don't. I silenced everyone. Sorry.
No, I mean, you're right. No, there has to be a spirit of charity that pervades the whole thing, and there has to be a sort of bond that sort of transcends just whatever latest terms of service you've signed with each other. You're right. And as far as how you get out of it, I don't really know. That's probably beyond the scope of this podcast, unfortunately. I don't really know if anyone has the answer. Yeah, because you're right. Once you get in a system like this, it's really hard to back out, because, everyone's got their own vested interests and everyone's got something to lose.
Well, we're not.
And I think
we're not the first ones to go there. I mean, this is late stage empire, and it kind of ends one way, and it isn't pretty. But maybe we're just at the fall of the republic, and we still have 300 or 400 more years of Caesaric empire. That's a possibility. Or maybe the barbarians are at the gate. I don't know.
Well, I mean, because it seems like the civil magistrates really dropped the ball. And since we're this democracy, it's because the people didn't hold the civil magistrate accountable. But wouldn't something just as simple as, since we have to protect people from usury, just be to ban usury and then return to a currency that, doesn't depreciate over time? Isn't that just kind of the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, hey, we're just not going to do this usury anymore. And it's going to be incredibly painful for everyone involved. Your retirement's going to get blown up, all these things are going to get blown up, but in the long run, it's going to, pay in spades, and we're going to transition to a actual currency instead of fiat.
Chief, I think I love the KISS method, and I think you could get there pretty quickly if you just banned, if you made any interest over, I don't know, pick a number, 9-10%, because then that cuts out all consumer lending, except for the folks who are basically can pay it off at any time anyway, right? And that also destroys the exorbitant, the worst parts of this. And it would, I think, drive it would drive. There's a case of financial repression that we kind of continually have, where the Federal Reserve holds the rates that the government itself has to pay artificially low. I think you would have a much flatter and higher interest rate curve, which sounds bad, but that would encourage savings, because you couldn't get above 10 for anything. So you would have because the demand for money remains the same, but you have less being lent out. You would increase that rate, which would, like I said, incentivize savings, which in any country where you incentivize savings, the currency in and of itself has higher staying power. That's just the way the math works. Could we ever go back on a gold standard or a commodity basket standard for the dollar? I wish. That's everybody blames Nixon, but it was really FDR that did that. Nixon, there was no way for the U.S. to support Bretton Woods anymore, and that's another topic for another day. But I don't know. I think the easiest way would be to just cap interest rates, all interest rates. That's not the best way long term, but I think that's the best way to get from here to there where we want to go, and then reintroduce some of these other things. That's what I would, if I were king, that's what I would immediately do, or at least phase it in over a period so that you don't cause too much translational damage in the process. But I don't know. I'm open for ideas. Any of it would be incredibly hard because those who are writing lobbying checks don't want any part of any of this.
Well, I think that's probably a half decent place to leave it. Give us an idea of where this plane lands eventually, and that there is an off ramp. We're not just stuck in 50-year mortgages, forever. But Ron, thank you so much for coming on.
Man, love being here. Thank you.
You're always great to have on. You want to give any plugs for anything you got going on?
I had a piece that I'm pretty proud of that just came out in the American Mind for the Claremont Institute on restraint and realism in foreign policy, against foreign adventurism. And then I had a piece on biblical leadership, on relying on that we are to be ruled by wise men, not by the written letter that came out in American Reformer. Both those pieces I'm really proud of. And then you can find me on Twitter, talking about stuff. So that's it.
Well, I think everyone should follow your work. You're absolutely great. I swear everything you put out is just excellent. You always have such great insight, and you always provide such wisdom for us younger folks out here trying to figure out what we've lost and trying to get a good heading into the world. So thank you for coming on. But I think that's going to wrap us up for the evening, unless Kev or Luke have anything they'd like to say.
No, nothing really to add except to thank you also for coming on. Great topic. I think we had a good conversation, and we'd like to have you on again sometime. I'm sure we will sometime soon. So
be my pleasure.
Yeah, appreciate it. Again, we posted this in the comments and show notes, but don't forget that there are other Old Glory Club streams tonight. We have the James Oglethorpe Society on Chapter House that's going on now that you can hop onto. Actually, that's the only one happening now, but that's one you can hop onto once we're done. So please take advantage of that. And we also, of course, welcome anyone to follow our social media accounts on X or on Substack, where you can keep up with kind of what we're doing. And of course, if you would like to join, if you're in North Carolina, reach out to the Nathanael Greene Society. If you're not North Carolina, reach out to your local state chapter, which you can find on the OGC's website. And if there's not one near you, then you should consider starting one. It's really easy, or it's certainly reasonably easy, and it just helps build up the movement. Also, of course, thank you for joining us and listening to us tonight. We'll be back next week with more great conversations and good topics. And we look forward to seeing you then.